They were once friends, but now one is out of power, and the other is in a sticky situation. You see, Russia has a whole bunch of bases in Syria, but now they are either surrounded by antagonistic former Syrian rebels, or only have a sea to retreat to, and thus Russia must figure out whether to stay, or how best to retreat from its tight spot. So, today, we will lead off with the current conditions on the ground for Russia in Syria. Then we will get to the levels of why Russia is preparing for an evacuation, the initial decision not to prop up the Assad regime, the possibility of just staying despite the change in government, the alternative of negotiating to rent out the spaces, and the more serious problem of trying to contain threats from militant groups. But we start with what the situation on the ground looks like right now. And I should note here that Syria exists outside of our space-time continuum. I know this is hard to believe, but for every 1 second that passes here, approximately 1 hour passes there. Or at least it feels that way. What I'm trying to tell you here is that there is a good chance that everything has changed quite a bit by the time you are watching this. Sorry. Anyway, most of the public's attention has been directed toward the Tartus naval facility and the Khamenei air base. You may have heard about the latter recently, as Assad's Telegram channel claims that he visited the base on December 8th to coordinate defensive measures with Russia, only to learn that rebels had captured Damascus in the meantime, which then resulted in his departure from the country. In any case, it looks like Russia is preparing to leave both. Russian ships at Tartus have moved a safe distance out to sea. Over at Khamenei, Russia is packing up its heavy gear that it does not want to leave behind. There are also AN-124 transport aircraft on the tarmac, apparently loading up Khamenei's supplies. Interesting side note, the AN-124 was originally designed in Ukraine, and is now the heaviest cargo plane in the world, following the destruction of the AN-225 that happened during the Battle of Hostomel Airport at the beginning of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Anyway, I want to emphasize 2 points here. 1, there is relatively little cost in moving your ships to sea, in case you think that, say, a stray bomb could randomly show up. 2, though flying out heavy equipment does come with a real cost, undoing that process is also readily feasible. So we should not take these headlines as proof positive that Russia is gone for good. The more interesting problem is with Russia's other holdings in Syria. There are a host of forward operating bases and the like sprinkled around the country, and unlike Tartus and Khamenei, they are not robustly entrenched and do not offer a way to move Russian holdings directly back to Russia. In other words, they are vulnerable, and the Russian troops there need to convoy west to the bigger facilities. Now, the best time to have done this was approximately day 1 of the offensive. But the offensive moved so rapidly that an organized trip westward was not possible. Fast forward to today, and one does not simply drive across country. There are a lot of kilometers to travel, and you could imagine that some Syrians may find them to be an attractive target. And if you are thinking that this would be a bad place for Russians to be, then pause this video, go watch Black Hawk Down, and you will conclude that yes, this is a very bad place to be indeed. Of course, what you have heard about Russia's potential evacuation might depend on which news sources you read. Interestingly, both left-leaning and right-leaning sources emphasize caution about what might be a Russian withdrawal. In contrast, the center places more focus on the general instability within Syria, and the problems this will cause for Russia regardless. But at least there was plenty of reporting on the topic across the political spectrum. That stands in contrast to Assad's first public comments from exile, which were more commonly covered within right-leaning media, and also focused on the military pressures that led to his departure from the country. How do I know all of this? Well, it is thanks to our returning sponsor for this video, Ground News. Beyond the news aggregation capability that Ground News is famous for, I want to highlight its bias comparison tool. The same story can go in a ton of different directions, and Ground News's bias comparison tool shows the systemic differences in the media ecospheres. And, for a limited time, my viewers get 50% off their unlimited access Vantage plan exclusively through my link, ground.news/linesonmaps. So head over to that link or scan the QR code to better inform yourself and support this channel. Alright, let's now go deeper into the various levels of Russia's conundrum and how the Kremlin might get out of it. The lead problem is with the failure of the Assad regime. This is a basic point that we have discussed before. I will therefore keep this part condensed, but it is still important because it feeds into the later issues. The basic story is that Russia is experiencing a manpower shortage in Ukraine, to the point that the Kremlin finds it easier to recruit out of North Korea. Russia could not handle both fronts at once. Ukraine is the bigger priority, and so, hugs or not, Assad found himself on the outside looking in. However, there is a subtle aspect missing from this standard narrative. Most of what Russia offered Assad was air support. Air support is a force multiplier. By itself, it would not be that effective. But pair it with boots on the ground belonging to regime loyalists, and it is deadly. Using Gaddafi as a comparison, just think about how quickly things turned south for his regime, once NATO began bombing runs in Libya. But aircraft now command a premium in Ukraine. When the United States unlocked the longer-range ATACMS missiles, the primary effect was to force Russian planes to pull back to bases behind the ATACMS radius. Now, the difference between GMLRS and ATACMS might seem negligible in this context. Yes, it is 300 kilometers versus 70 kilometers, but 230 kilometers does not seem like much when you are in a jet. And, in terms of airtime, that is true. The problem is that minutes in air translates to more maintenance on the ground. Warplanes are complicated and expensive machines, and you do not want something to go wrong in the middle of a flight. Preventive maintenance is the only way to have some confidence that everything will be okay. To illustrate the issue, even operating under an aggressive scheme, the MiG-29 should have at least 10 hours of inspection and repair for every hour in the air. As a result, some of the estimates indicate that ATACMS are reducing Russian bombing runs by almost half. So, given the choice between rerouting more aircraft to Syria versus removing them from Syria and reinforcing Ukraine, well, that was an easy decision for the Kremlin. So, Assad is gone. But why not just try to stay in your bases anyway? The far-flung ones might not be feasible anymore, but once you get everyone back to Tartus and Hmeimim, you could just stay holed up and refuse to leave. It may seem strange to possess military bases in what is now an unfriendly country, but look no further than Guantanamo Bay for inspiration. Well, Russia would encounter the same problem here as with the original Assad situation. The bases contain a ton of valuable equipment that could be put to good use elsewhere, namely Ukraine. But let's imagine that the Kremlin wants to give it a try. To get that to work, the implicit deterrent threat that Russia would make toward Syria is that any attempt to evict Russia would be met by force in kind, and so it would be better for Syria to just ignore the entire situation. The problem here is that Russia just abandoned the Assad regime because the Kremlin wanted to avoid fighting a two-front war. It would be doing the same thing again. Now, it would be a bit different if Russian troops were under direct fire, but protecting the Assad regime was Russia's best chance to preserve the status quo. The Kremlin passed on that opportunity, signaling a general lack of commitment on the issue. Recognizing this, the incoming Syrian government would be tempted to make a move, calculating that Russia would just retreat once again. Of course, there is another way to convince the government to allow Russia to stay: money. If we are truly living in the Second Cold War, why not revert to the era where bipolar superpower competition allows third-party countries to drive up the revenue? Remember, the reasons why Russia wants to keep the bases are 1. To maintain a naval presence within the geopolitically important Mediterranean Sea, and 2. To give logistical support to the Africa Corps operations that remain ongoing all over that continent. To help us think through the incentives here, let's use R to represent the value to Russia if it keeps its bases, minus the costs that come along with it. And yeah, we will be getting back to that point later. Meanwhile, call S the value to Syria of removing Russia from them. Note that the discussion from the last chapter indicates to us that Syria would actively enjoy retaking the territory, so S is positive. But here is the thing. If R is greater than S, it would be better for Russia to just pay Syria to keep the bases there. Of course, any longtime viewer of this channel knows that the theoretical existence of efficient agreements can fall victim to all sorts of bargaining problems. But it is worth questioning the more basic issue of whether such an agreement is feasible. It might just be that Syria hates the situation more than Russia benefits from it. Now, you might ask yourself, why is Russia so off-putting to the former rebels? Well, to avoid writing a novel about the subject, a condensed summary is that Russia's intervention hammered rebel-held areas. Monitors estimated 2,000 civilians were killed within the first 6 months of the intervention. Drafts of United Nations Security Council resolutions criticized Russia for indiscriminate bombing. They never passed, of course, because Russia has veto power on the Security Council. But perhaps the biggest criticism was Russia's targeting of hospitals, a problem that was consistent enough that it has its own Wikipedia page. So, again, maybe Syria is unwilling to accept any price that Russia is willing to offer. However, thinking outside of the monetary box, there is something else of value that Russia could trade to Syria. But there are two significant problems with giving up Assad. First, Russia has a bunch of partners in other countries that could one day find themselves in a similar position as the former Syrian leader. Part of what keeps them cooperative is the expectation that, if things turn really south, they can always land with a golden parachute in Moscow. Just ask Viktor Yanukovych about that one. Sacrificing Assad may help solve the Syrian base problem, but it will make a lot of other leaders question their allegiance to the Kremlin. Second, what happens once Assad is handed over? Syria's government has what it wants at that point. Al-Jilani could tell Russia that he is altering the deal, and there's not much that Moscow could do about it. Let's zoom out for a second. The normal way for such agreements to work in practice is a continuous stream of cash in exchange for the lease. Beyond a one-time goodwill apology payment, a sudden influx of value like that does not work well, precisely because if this is what Syria cares about, the cash is no longer sufficient to prolong the agreement once Assad is in custody. Actually, there is another credible commitment issue here for Syria. Russia's primary value for a base in the Mediterranean is in case a crisis breaks out in the region. Day-to-day operations of TARDIS mostly incur costs without direct benefits. Now, the Kremlin is willing to incur those costs as an insurance policy. But in the event of a true crisis, Syria could just make a move on Russia at that point. Consequently, Russia would see an accumulation of costs to run the bases, and an accumulation of rent payments to Syria, all go for nothing. In sum, just because Russia is willing to pay an acceptable price does not mean that a deal will get done. But let's say for a moment that Syria is willing to entertain an offer. Then we need to end by looking more closely at how much Russia profits from those bases. In other words, imagine that whatever government forms in Syria is amenable to keeping a Russian presence. A major problem remains in the costs that Russia would expect to pay. Go back to those headlines for a moment. There are a lot of Syrians that would not support a continued Russian presence in the country. And there are a lot of existing militant groups in the country, not to mention more that could form. Combine these together, and my self-respecting academic alter ego would tell you that you have an explosive recipe. Militant groups need donations and recruits to keep their enterprises running. And like many other businesses, some turn to advertising. Consider a young Syrian man of no real importance. He is ideologically extreme, which may make his preferences seem strange to you and I, But let's try to understand his perspective for a second. One day in the fall of 2001, he turns on the TV, sees what is happening, and says, "Yep, that's what I want to do with my life." And when the opportunity presents itself 2 years later, as the United States is preparing to topple Saddam Hussein, this young man gets on a bus and travels from Damascus to Iraq. Soon thereafter, he joins Iraq's al-Qaeda affiliate, because, remember, al-Qaeda is the group capable of doing things like that. And that is part of why groups conduct those attacks in the first place. It drives such recruiting as well as funding. Oh, and by the way, that is a very simplified origin story of al-Jilani. I swear, if he sticks with the promised reforms to moderate, the absurdity of such a story arc is rarely seen outside of professional wrestling. In any case, for any militant group looking to make a name for itself, it would be hard to find a better target than the Russian bases. They are the perfect remaining symbol of Assad's oppression. So if you want to send the signal that you are the true carrier of justice, then look no further than Khamenei. Then there is a yet deeper problem involving how the Syrian government would respond to this. As the sovereign entity of the territory, it falls on the government to police the situation and stop such attacks from happening, ostensibly to protect the value Russia is offering to rent out the bases. It is a legacy of the Peace of Westphalia. Yep, somehow treaties from 1648 that ended the 30 Years' War still instruct how state behavior works today. Well, after more than a decade of war, it is unclear whether the incoming government will have the capacity to actually police the situation properly. However, assuming that they do, there is a temptation to look the other way, even if the current orders are to let the Russian soldiers be. After all, the government would not lose any sleep over it. Now, the standard way to circumvent this problem is for Russia to overpay the government, so that the latter has a greater stake in keeping the peace. But that is putting yet further pressure on the constraints of what Russia might be willing to pay. And even if the government complies in good faith, police actions can still fail, and then Russia is still paying the cost of the attack. It is such a soupy mess that Russia might just be better off abandoning the enterprise altogether. Meanwhile, one enterprise I am not abandoning is this traditional end of the video. Check the video description for more information about these wonderful books. And if you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.